stop this video and get started. So welcome everybody to the Halloween edition of the Wisconsin Maple Hour. Today we are joined by Allan Braun, the Wisconsin State Forester for the United States Department of Agriculture and Natural Resource Conservation Service, or USDA NRCS. We're going to be talking about USDA funding opportunities for Sugarbush forestry, specifically focused on NRCS programs. So with that, I just want to remind everybody to enter any questions that you have in the chat throughout the presentation. And again, we will be recording this session, so you'll have an opportunity to get any of these resources after the fact as well. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, launch a poll, and turn it over to Allan.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it. Should I not share until the poll is done?
Nope, you can get your
Okay.
presentation up, and I've just got a quick pre-presentation poll. And the question is whether participants have ever, or whether the attendees have ever participated in an NRCS cost share conservation program or a DNR cost share conservation program. So that could be EQIP, CSP, CRP from the NRCS. It could be Wiffle Gap or other related programs from DNR. Just trying to get a feeling for if folks have ever walked through these programs before. And we can just let that poll go in the background. Allan, your presentation looks good from my end. I'm going to stop my video as you're going and you can get started.
All right. Thanks, Tony. So as Tony mentioned, I'm the Wisconsin State Forester for Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. A little bit on my background. I went to college at UW-Stevens Point, got a degree in forest management there back in the early aughts, and worked for the U.S. Forest Service up until 2019, doing a full range of forestry activities, silvicultural prescriptions, timber sale preparation, all those types of things. Then I jumped over to NRCS in 2019 and became the state forester shortly thereafter. Let's see. Having a little trouble advancing here, Tony.
Will the arrows in the bottom left work on the slide? I'm not sure if that's live.
There we go. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, just hard for me to see, getting older. All right, so just want to start out with how NRCS and forestry interact. So we provide technical and financial assistance to private non-industrial forest landowners. In a nutshell, we're here to help you with things that are good forest management, but cost you money. So that's where we step in and provide some cost share, help you plan out some of those projects. I should say right off the bat that NRCS, our history is more agricultural, soil science based, and a lot of our field office employees still come from that background. So we're not necessarily going to have forestry experts in every office. They'll have some basic forestry knowledge, but we do often rely on some partners to help us meet our forestry obligations. So that could be local DNR foresters, could be Rough Grouse Society partner foresters, or National Wild Turkey Federation partner foresters. But we do have access to folks to make sure that we can provide that assistance. So there are 54 local NRCS offices located throughout the state. Not quite one per county. There's several offices that cover multiple counties, especially as you get further north. But you can find contact information for those service centers at this link. And hopefully I can demo that. So this is the interface that pops up. You go to this menu to select your state.
Oh, hey, Allan, We're
Yep.
still looking at the slides. You
Oh,
got the
yeah, I
EQIP
suppose
slide
so.
up.
Okay. All right,
There. Yep, now we got it.
perfect. Okay, so I'll look at that again. So this menu here, you select your state. Obviously, we're going with Wisconsin. The next option is to select your county. I'm just gonna go with Ashland since it's near the top. You hit that search button. And you will see there's several options here. Natural Resources Conservation Services here at the top, but there's also options for Farm Service Agency and rural development. But this will give you a phone number to call, give you a physical address if you want to go to the office itself, and also give you an email address for the district conservationist who is running that office. So several ways you can communicate with your local service center. And to for folks that are don't live on their land and may live in a different county, you would want to contact the service center where your land is located. So the county where your land is located, that is the correct service center to contact. I'm gonna go back over to my slides.
I just shared the results of the poll here where we've got a majority of the attendees who have not participated in either the NRCS or DNR cost share.
Sure. Yep, and that's certainly not unusual. We're kind of one of the best kept secrets out there. Oh, looks like I jumped ahead here. All right. So we have two main financial assistance programs or cost share programs, we call them. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which we call EQIP for short, and then the Conservation Stewardship Program or CSP. And I'm going to be talking more in depth on those here, both of those in a second. One thing I'm going to say several times throughout this presentation is that before we're going to go ahead with cost share assistance on forest land, we're going to want to see a forest plan in place. And that you might also hear that called a forest management plan or a forest stewardship plan. Either way, we need that kind of overarching document that takes your objectives. It's written by a professional forester. It takes your objectives and describes how to get to your end goal. And so we can kind of see the whole process from beginning to end rather than just looking at things from a one project by project basis. So very important to have that kind of overarching roadmap in place before you go ahead with individual projects. So with that, I will jump into the EQIP program. I should give a caveat right off the bat here. I am a forester. I'm not necessarily an expert on these programs, so I'm giving you the best knowledge I have to share. But do rest assured that if you go into one of our service centers, the folks there work with these programs all the time. They can definitely steer you to what is going to work well for you. So definitely rely on those folks to help you out. So the EQIP program, that's going to be cost share and technical assistance more for individual projects, or it could be related projects that all string together to meet an end goal. So an important point here, and sometimes it can trip people up, is that the project is going to have to meet our NRCS criteria for the practice. So we have what are called practices, and those are used to solve what we call resource concerns, which is basically just another word for something that we consider to be a problem conservation wise. So we're going to try to fix that problem and implement good conservation. Each practice that we have has what's called a standard document. And you can think of those standards as kind of setting the sideboards of what we can and can't do within that practice. So sometimes landowners will come in and they'll look at those standards and they might think that they're too restrictive for what they want to do, or They might consider that what we're going to ask them to do to meet the standard is more work than they were initially thinking that they wanted to do. And that's okay. You know, these programs aren't going to be a good fit for every person or every project. But even if they're not, hopefully we can point you to some technical guidance that might be able to help you out, even if we can't provide financial assistance. Typically, a contract in EQIP is going to last for about 2 to 3 years, but they can be longer than that. They can go as long as 10 years, but typically for most landowners, trying to complete a project within that 2 to 3 years seems to be a good time frame for all involved. And requirement is that the land is considered non-industrial private forest land. And basically all that means is that you don't own a mill where you're producing commercial output and the land is basically feeding that mill. You know, if you have a little portable sawmill where you're milling up some lumber for personal projects, that's not a big deal. But if you have a larger operation where you're selling wood products and that the land is being used to feed the mill, that's where we wouldn't get involved. There's also some income eligibility. Basically, you can't be a millionaire and participate in this program. And so there's going to be a few forms to fill out at the office to verify that that's not the case. Typically not a problem for most of us. And then again, we're going to require that forest plan be in place before we can implement any practices on your forest land. And the practices that we're going to implement should be identified in that forest plan. And if they're not, and it's still sound forestry, we can always go ahead and make amendments to the forest plan, modify it. Those are intended to be living documents, so they can definitely adapt and change as maybe your objectives change or conditions on the ground change. All right, so the next program is the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. So this program is a little bit different. It's intended more for landowners who've been doing a lot of conservation work over the years. They've solved some of what we would call resource concerns on their land. And typically the best applications or the highest ranking applications there are probably going to have shown some successful EQIP projects that have been completed in the past. These contracts are for a set length, 5 years, and they can be renewed multiple times. And so what this program does is it basically provides annual payment in each of those 5 years for maintaining your conservation projects that you've already done. And then going above and beyond and adding some additional conservation. And that can be through what we call enhancements, which our national office has basically come up with ways kind of prepackaged that you can go above and beyond your existing conservation efforts. But it can be just our typical practices as well, if that fits better what you want to do. There are some eligibility requirements for this one as well. You have to be current with the Farm Service Agency. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You have to be the owner of the land, or the owner of the land has to sign off on what you're wanting to do out there. And then basically you have to have solved 2 resource concerns, and a minimum of 2 resource concerns in the past. So again, you've fixed several conservation problems in the past. So sometimes the process to apply for these programs, it can seem a little bit daunting. These are federal programs, so there's going to be a certain amount of paperwork involved. But I just want to go over here the general process so you get an idea of what would happen. And again, if you work with the folks at the field office, they'll also be able to walk you through this process and help you out along the way. So the first step, if your land is not registered with the Farm Service Agency, you need to get a farm and tract number for your property. Oftentimes the Farm Service Agency office and the NRCS offices are co-located. They're in the same buildings. So you can basically do one-stop shopping with that. You can take care of business over at FSA and then also go over to the NRCS side of the building and start getting to work there. Yeah, it seems kind of strange that you would get a farm number for a piece of forest land, but again, that just goes back to the history of these agencies starting more from an agricultural basis and getting more into forestry in the last few decades. So just kind of a relic of past verbiage there. Once you have that in place, you go over to the NRCS side of the office, determine if your project is going to work with any of our programs. And again, it may or may not, depending on how it fits within our standards. Maybe there's some adjustments that could be made, and see if that's something you'd be willing to do to make sure it fits within standards. If things are initially looking good, then you submit an application for assistance, and then at that point, then there'll be some more detailed planning that'll happen. That's where some of that technical assistance will come in, make sure that your project is ready to go, shovel ready. And then you'll hear every once in a while, there'll be announcements from NRCS that we have some deadlines coming up. And so those are basically deadlines where all the applications we've received in the last few months, they're going to be batched together and ranked. And so we do have one of those application deadlines coming up here on November 3rd for the EQIP program. So that's something to keep in mind. With that said, getting an application in just a few days before that deadline is probably not going to be it's probably not going to work out well. Basically, the more time you can give that field office to help you plan out your project and get it shovel ready, the better that project is going to fare as it goes through the ranking process. So get those applications in early. We do accept them year round. So if you miss the November 3rd deadline, no problem. There's probably going to be another EQIP batching period in the springtime. So you can always aim for that one. But again, if you're thinking about springtime EQIP, you'd want to get your application in here in the next couple months, just to make sure that there's some time for planning.
Hey, Allan, if I could just jump in quick. We've got two questions that are relevant to the conversation right now. So I think in terms of the first one, the question is around a typical time frame for a landowner or their forester to receive confirmation or review by a field office for a current forest stewardship plan or other program opportunities. Could you just talk about the timeline, maybe in terms of the upcoming application? So if somebody had already got their application in for this November 3rd EQIP timeline or ranking, what would kind of the next steps look like in terms of turnaround?
Sure. Yeah. So for the November deadline here for EQIP, after that deadline, basically the field offices are going to take all the applications they've received, and then they're going to go through what they call ranking, which is basically they're going to look at those projects compared to conservation priorities for the state and compared to the benefits that project conservation wise is going to provide. And basically they assign a point value to each project, and then they see how far down the allocated dollars we have reach. And so that process takes a few months. It's going to be probably midwinter or so before everything is ranked and ready to go. And then at that point, if your project is one that the funding amounts got to, then they would contact you and offer you a contract.
And
And so
then
that would be something.
I was just gonna say, sorry to jump in.
Mhm.
So the kind of best practices would probably be to already have your application in if you're really looking for that 2024 funding, just because we're a couple of days away from that deadline. And just to note that Wisconsin did announce that they will be doing a second EQIP sign up May 17th. So that would be kind of the other date to have in your mind if EQIP is the program that you're interested in. Then CSP's got a timeline of February 9th. And do both programs kind of have similar process in terms of the turnaround from the batching or ranking date to the actual implementation of the contracts?
Yeah, yep. So yeah, it'll be similar. It'll take them a few months to go through the ranking process and get to where they know what projects can be offered a contract.
Okay, and then the last point here from the chat is around whether landowners can go and talk with their district conservationists at the NRCS office and see if if they have projects that might be eligible for programming before they go through the steps of the FSA number and some of those administrative steps. Are district conservationists willing to just talk with people to kind of see if it makes sense before they go through all the effort to apply?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, every district conservationist would be willing to have that conversation before you go over to the FSA side of the office. So yeah,
Perfect.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Those first two bullet points there, you could do those interchangeably. Really, you could do the second one first if you wanted to, and probably not a bad idea, really. Yeah.
Mhm. All right. Thank you.
Yep. You bet. Thanks, Tony. All right. So yeah. So once the ranking process is over, and if your project ranks high enough, you'd be offered a contract. And at that point, that's when it's really decision time. At any point before that or up to that point, you can back out of this process and say, I'm not, something came up that I'm just not feeling good about it. I don't want to do it. But if you're offered a contract and you sign it, then that's when you're basically committed to saying, yes, I'm going to do this project within the timeline that's in the contract. So that's when things get serious at that point. With that said, there's always some flexibility there if there's natural disasters or family emergencies that happen. We're going to be able to work with some of those unforeseen circumstances. But for the most part, once you sign that contract, that's when you're saying, "Yep, I'm going to do this," and we're going for it. Important note: we don't want you to start any work before you sign the contract. So make sure you don't do that. That will cause problems. So do not start any work until after the contract is signed. And then also important to note that the cost share payment isn't going to come to you until after the project's complete. And the NRCS folks have been out there and said, yep, it meets the standards, we're good to go. So if there are some initial expenses that need to be covered, that's going to be something that's going to have to happen out of pocket. So make sure you plan for that. Just remember that cost share payment happens after the project's done. So there might be materials you need to buy or contractors you need to pay before that cost share payment hits your bank account. So it's always good to recognize that. Okay, with that, I'm gonna go into some of our practices. So again, these practices are the things that we will implement that are going to fix these conservation problems or what we call resource concerns. So the first one I've mentioned several times, there has to be a forest plan in place before we're going to implement practices. So this one technically we call this more of a conservation activity than a practice because you're not actually implementing conservation, you're more planning it out. But we do offer cost share assistance on that forest management plan itself. So as I mentioned before, that management plan's going to provide that roadmap that's going to get you to the point where you're meeting your objectives for that forest. And certainly a valid objective could be sap production for maple syrup or other species. So you basically be working with a professional forester to get this plan done. They're gonna ask you questions, figure out what's important to you in your forest and how to get to where you want to go, and then they'll document that in the plan. If it's through NRCS, written through NRCS, we have a list of technical service provider foresters that have gone through some extra training to write plans for NRCS. And so you can use that website link there to find a technical service provider. And let me see if I can demo that here quick. Did that pop up, Tony?
Yep. It's yep, looks good.
Yep. So this is it's called Registry. So this is for all of NRCS nationwide. So I recommend that people use these filter options on the left-hand side. Just choose a state. And then you can drill down to county, and I recommend that. For this purpose of demonstration, I'm just going to leave that at all counties right now. And then come down to this filter by practice and the practice code box and choose this 106 CAP forest management plan. And then you got to scroll all the way down here to apply filters. And then a list of all of the technical service provider foresters we have available throughout the state will pop up. As you can see, we have about 40 folks right now, 40 folks or businesses available to write these plans. And we're always looking to add foresters as well, so that list does change over time. It doesn't remain static. I'm going to stop sharing that and go back to my presentation. All right. So that's, basically that's how you would find a forester to write a plan when you're going through NRCS cost share. Now, with that said, if you have an existing forest plan and you didn't have it done through NRCS, we can still accept plans outside of NRCS cost share for practice cost share for practices within those plans. So, basically what we'd be looking for there is that it was written by a professional forester. It has those objectives and the roadmap to get there on a stand-by-stand basis. It has a good stand map, forest map there included, and it's backed by some data that came from an inventory of your forest lands. So, if it meets those basic requirements, we're good to go with cost sharing practices from that plan, even if it wasn't written through NRCS. That can be kind of confusing for folks. There's kind of the two different pathways to go there. Cost share with NRCS, or you can do it on your own. So hopefully that helps with that. All right, another common, and this is one of our actual practices, is forest stand improvement. And so this is a pretty broad umbrella term that covers a wide range of different silvicultural techniques. Basically, anytime a tree is being cut, it probably falls under this forest stand improvement practice. And so some common ways we see this applied in Wisconsin are tree release, basically where you have some desirable trees that are being outcompeted by undesirable ones. And so you would cut the undesirable trees around your desirable trees and give them a lot more room to grow. Could also be a non-commercial thinning or pre-commercial thinning. Oftentimes that's more when a forest is young and you're trying to influence the species composition that it ends up with, or just to make sure that each tree has room to grow. With that said, there are definitely applications for that in parts of the state where there isn't good commercial markets to do commercial thinning in, say, a mature stand, but you still have some of those goals that you want to improve the health of your forest. But it's just not going to work to get a logger to do it just because there's no place to take the wood. We can certainly help out in those situations as well. And then in situations where you are thinking about doing a commercial harvest, a timber harvest, we can provide cost share assistance for the marking of trees, either to be cut or the trees to be left, depending on what makes more sense. But that way, basically, we're looking to get a professional forester involved with that timber harvest and make sure that the loggers are taking the right trees that are going to make sure that your objectives are met there. And certainly all these activities that I mentioned could certainly be commonly used in sugarbush operations. So if you're looking at releasing crowns of your best productive trees, sap producers, that's basically kind of a tree release operation. Or if you just need to do a thinning, you have too many trees in there for the amount of area, and you want to improve the health by taking some of those trees out, giving the remaining trees a lot more room to grow and thrive. That we can get involved with that as well. Another very common practice in Wisconsin is what we call brush management. That's basically where we have woody stemmed invasive, non-native invasive plants. When we're treating those, that's what we're going to call brush management. So think of those as oftentimes they're going to be your shrubby type of very aggressive species. So things like honeysuckles, non-native honeysuckles, common glossy buckthorn, barberry, multiflora rose, all kinds of those woody stem plants that often just end up taking over an area. That's where we would use this brush management practice. So we do want to make sure that treatments are effective when we're doing this, and we use UW extension fact sheets for each of these species that we might be treating. And we're going to say, or we're going to require that there's at least 50% or better control of the species the year after treatment. And oftentimes where that's going to lead you to is you either have to remove the roots, the root ball of each plant, or you're going to need to use herbicides. And the reason for that is if you just cut these plants, they're often going to resprout, and they'll resprout with where you had one stem, they'll resprout with multiple stems, and you can really just create a bigger problem if you don't use some method that's going to actually remove that sprouting capability. And that means that you have to either remove the roots or kill the roots somehow. And so a typical treatment we would see here for that would be you would start with some mechanical mowing, especially if you have some really tall plants where it's going to be hard to treat them with herbicide just because you can't reach the leaves. So you might mow those with a fecon or some other kind of very tough forestry mower. And then once you mow them, you let them resprout, and once they're a foot or two tall, then you can go over the top of them pretty easily with herbicide to treat those resprouts. And then you're going to need to also follow up for several years with some spot treatment here and there where maybe the initial herbicide application didn't hold, or maybe you got some sprouting from seed bank, that type of thing. It's something you're going to have to constantly keep on top of. Another common practice for us is tree or shrub establishment. And that's basically just a fancy term for saying we're planting trees and shrubs. For this practice, we are focused more on the native trees and shrubs. And so if in a sugar bush situation, if you're, basically 100% stocking of sugar maple, and maybe you're concerned about wildlife habitat or climate change impacts and wanting to increase some species diversity within your sugar bush, this might be an application where we could use this practice. Now, there's definitely issues with browse on seedlings of desirable trees in Wisconsin. So we do offer several options to protect newly planted seedlings or natural regeneration as well. And so those could be tubes, wire cages, or we do offer also, we can do temporary perimeter fencing around an area. We can use what we call slash, or usually the tops or non-commercial parts of trees that are left over after a commercial timber harvest. We can actually pile those into a wall that surrounds a regeneration area. And with any of those area-based measures, we are going to make sure there's a gate put in so that you can still access them. But if you're using a tubing system or something of that nature with your syrup operation, that fencing or slash wall may not work very well. But just realize that there are some options out there for browse to make sure that your regeneration can successfully establish. I did mention before with our Conservation Stewardship Program, the enhancements. There is one under our tree and shrub establishment practice that's intended to increase species diversity within a sugar bush to the point where other species make up at least 20% of stocking. We definitely realize that's not going to be for everyone. If you're really looking to max out your sap production, that's probably not going to be something you want to do. But for those who are interested in adding some species diversity to their sugar bush, that could be a good option. All right, so I know on one of the first maple hours, Beth Peterson, our assistant state engineer, came in and talked about energy efficiency and some of the different practices we offer there. I am going to say again, I am a forester. I'm not an engineer, and I don't understand a lot of the processing side of the maple syrup business very well. But I did want to give folks an update here from what she had said before. There's been one change to what she presented. So there is they're looking to streamline the process to get a reverse osmosis system. And basically with any of our energy efficiency practices, you need to get an energy audit beforehand. You can think of that kind of like as a forest plan for your processing operation. But basically that energy audit is going to identify ways where you might be able to upgrade equipment in order to save on energy costs. And we offer a variety of options there, from some souped up evaporators to preheaters to these reverse osmosis systems. But again, there was a requirement there that first you had to have that energy audit that identified the best way to go there. But they have identified a situation where the energy efficiency benefits are definitely worth the cost share, that we can bypass that energy audit. And that situation for maple syrup producers is going to be operations that produce at least 100 gallons of syrup on an annual basis. You're currently not using that reverse osmosis. Then you can bypass the audit to install reverse osmosis. I did hear Beth say when this was initially presented that energy audits are still encouraged, even if you meet that, if you're in that situation, especially if you're, just slightly over that 100-gallon mark. There may be other ways that you can upgrade your energy usage or become more energy efficient without necessarily going to reverse osmosis. So she still did recommend that you go through the energy audit process. There's probably a lot of value to doing that. But I wanted to update folks on that. Again, I am not an engineer, so I'm not sure I can answer a lot of questions on that, but wanted to make sure that information was out there. Now I want to talk about some funding sources that are coming our way that are going to go into the EQIP program and the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, that I talked about before. So at the national level, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed a year or two ago now. Basically, we're seeing a lot of funding coming our way for our existing programs in EQIP and CSP. And that money's going to be coming our way for the next 5 years. So 2023 to 2027. In particular for this funding, the practices have to have carbon storage benefit, looking for a climate change, basically trying to reduce the effects of climate change. And so there are some practices that we've identified that are going to have that benefit. So tree and shrub establishment, like I mentioned. Along with that, if you have to do some site preparation to get those trees established, that's what we consider a supporting practice. That would also be eligible. The forest stand improvement practice that I talked about would be eligible. Wildlife habitat plantings. So think about things like native prairie establishment, that's eligible. And then agroforestry practices are also eligible. So things like alley cropping, silvopasture, riparian forest buffers, windbreaks. A lot of those are going to apply more in agricultural settings, but could certainly apply to folks here. But basically, those practices are where you're adding trees to existing agricultural operations. So there'll be some carbon storage benefits there. Of note, this is statewide, and it is going to be somewhat limited in the practices that we're going to use to fund or use that funding for. But with that said, we still get our underlying typical funding that comes out of the Farm Bill, and that we use to address things like erosion and water quality and those types of things. So basically, this funding is probably going to, what we would say, it'll float all boats, just because the practices that can be funded with the Inflation Reduction Act will shunt those over that way. And then that'll free up more money for the other practices that aren't necessarily related. And with that said, you don't have to know what funding pool you want or your project might fit into. That's all going to happen at the field office level. They'll handle that. Basically, the thing for you to know about this is that there's going to be a lot of funding available here the next few years. And so it's going to be a really good time to submit applications for projects, because you're going to have a good likelihood that your project gets funded. And that's not always the case throughout history. So, if you're waiting to strike while the iron's hot, the iron is hot right now. So, and it will be for the next few years. Another new funding source that we've come up with here it's not statewide. It's only in Northeast Wisconsin, but it's called the Northeast Wisconsin Forestry and Wildlife Partnership, and it's a Joint Chiefs project. And basically, what that means, the Joint Chiefs refer to the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service and the Chief of NRCS, and so these are projects that include. It's basically centered on public U.S. Forest Service land, and then includes surrounding private and tribal lands. And we're trying to do projects that are kind of tied to each other on each land base. So We're looking for a large enough project area that we can make a difference out there. And the general priorities of the Joint Chiefs program are wildfire reduction, water quality, wildlife habitat, climate change, general forest health. And so this project has 3 years of funding. The first year was actually this last year, so we're going into year 2 here on this funding source. And so as far as where in Northeast Wisconsin this is located, this map tells you where we're at. Basically Oneida, Forest, and Florence, south down to Shawano counties. So it includes a pretty good chunk of Northeast Wisconsin. And so the focus of this individual project, again, how we kind of tied it to wildfire reduction, is that there's been some fairly significant blowdown from storms there in 2019 and 2022. And so we're looking to see if there's still some cleanup that can be done, remove a lot of that woody fuel from the forest floor, and make sure that if a fire were to come through, we'd be decreasing the effects of that. There's also a lot of brook trout habitat in that area, so we're focused on water quality projects. That could be fish passage type of projects with culverts. If you have some culverts on your road system on your land, that might be perched and making it difficult for aquatic organisms to go back and forth. And that's something we'd be interested in. Wildlife habitat for golden winged warblers and monarch butterflies. And so that could be things like early successional habitat for golden winged warbler, or some of those pollinator or prairie type plantings for monarch butterflies. And then we're gonna basically, any forestry project that comes through the door is going to be eligible for this fund pool. So if you have a forestry or wildlife project and you're within that county area, it's, again, this is basically going to be another good chance to make sure your project gets funded. And so how this works on the NRCS side is it's basically would work similar to EQIP. So it's going to be the same kind of deadlines and sign up periods. So for this fund pool, the November 3rd deadline coming up applies to this as well. And then also the spring sign up. We are getting about 1.5 million over the 3-year period. That was our ask. Every year, the national office decides how much we're actually going to get. Usually it'll be a little bit less than what we asked for, but we should end up close to that 1.5 million over that 3 years. We didn't ask for a whole lot of money in year 1 just because we were just getting started. So a lot of that money is going to be coming here this year and next year. So those will be the really good opportunities in that part of the state to get funding. And then just so that you know, on the public land side of things, on U.S. Forest Service, they're getting about $1 million over that 3-year period. And they're focused on similar projects for culvert replacements, treating oak wilt, fuel reductions, and then also looking to plant some different species in their ash wetlands that are being threatened by emerald ash borer. All right, and that is the end of my presentation. So I'm ready to take questions on anything we talked about or any other related topics.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Allan. I think that was a really good overview of some opportunities for maple syrup producers to take advantage of and Sugarbush managers. I did want to go back to Matt's question from earlier on. I think I misread that. And I would just say, so my background before starting with Extension, I worked at a NRCS service center as a soil conservationist doing conservation planning. And I think the best way to understand if you've got a project that might be eligible in an existing forestry plan is to call your district conservationist and set up a time to go into the office and sit down. It might take an hour to go through the plan and some of the eligibility documents as far as, just making sure that the land qualifies and you qualify and the practices qualify, but you should be able to sort that out whether it makes sense for you to apply or not within that one meeting. So I think as long as you call the district conservationist who works locally and you kind of tell them what you're interested in and you can come with the documentation that you need, you should be able to kind of have a yes or no answer whether it makes sense to go through the hoops to apply for that practice or not based on those kind of contingencies. Does that make sense to you, Alan?
Yep, you bet.
Okay. Yeah. And then after that, you kind of enter in that timeline process where there's some of those internal scoring questions and that kind of stuff. So we got another question here about someone who rents rents a sugar bush. So they have a sugar house and they rent all the woodland around for syrup production. And they're curious if you need a forestry management plan on the land that you rent to qualify for the EQIP program.
Yes, you definitely would. So that could be, I mean, it's basically going to be the actual owner of the land would probably be the one that is going to drive the writing of the plan. Although I would assume that as the renter, you would also be involved in making sure that your needs are considered within that plan as well.
Yep. Yeah. So you will need a plan and or whether you're
And,
renting here, you consider the
yep.
operator there. Yep.
And then I should
Um,
say too, Tony, if once you get a plan and you're starting to implement practices, the renter can kind of drive the process, but there would be a little bit of paperwork for the landowner, the actual landowner, to sign off on to say, yes, I approve of what my renter wants to do here. Just so that we're certain that the landowner is aware of what's going on and they're okay with it.
Yep. Okay. Great. And then, yeah, I guess one of the reasons why I was looking forward to this program today and interested to kind of bring some of these opportunities to the maple syrup audience is there, like you were mentioning, Alan, this is a really great time for funding. There's a lot that's available. And I think, historically, a lot of the money has been kind of focused on traditional agricultural practices. So farmers are very accustomed to going to their service center and working through the process. But I think a lot of times woodland owners maybe don't understand that they qualify, and then maybe they don't understand the kind of mechanics of the process. So that was kind of my hope, is just outline some of these opportunities. And but I think one of the caveats there is that, as you mentioned, with each of these programs, there are certain eligibility requirements. And we've got a comment in the chat about a forest landowner who was applying for some cleanup aid from some storms and was denied at their local office, saying that there was syrup makers that didn't qualify for that specific program. And I think that's one thing that's difficult with some of these different funding pools, is that there are just special circumstances for each of them. So it is best to work with your local district conservationist to kind of understand what makes sense for you, but then also recognize that each service center and county office, the district conservationist there has whatever expertise they have. And as Alan mentioned, a lot of them are not forestry trained foresters. And so what would you recommend for somebody who's maybe having trouble at their local service center in getting an application in, or kind of working through that planning process? Is there things that landowners can do? I've just heard
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So I think there's a couple things that they could do. One is if they have a relationship with their local DNR foresters. If the DNR forester thinks your project is a good idea, sometimes they can have an influence on the district conservationist. So that could be a good way to go. Or you can give each of our field offices is located in one of 4 areas of the state that NRCS separates it into 4 areas, and it's pretty basic. It's northeast, northwest, southwest, southeast. So you could also find out contact information for the area office, and then ask your questions there, or just request to the district conservationist, hey, I saw this presentation. I think this should be possible. Can you just ask your area office and elevate this question?
Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of times it does pay to, really be your own advocate there. There's a lot of demand on the local service centers to manage contracts and manage the paperwork, and it is, just
Yeah,
important to
that's
be your own.
yeah, that's a really good point too, Tony. We have limited staffing at a lot of these field offices, and so they're trying to get a lot done out there. So definitely, keep in mind that they're working on a lot of different projects out there. So if things aren't happening maybe quite as quickly as you want them to, they'll get to your project eventually. But sometimes patience is required.
Yep, and that's another point is if you apply for funding and you're not accepted, there is almost always an opportunity to roll over that application to the next funding cycle where you can be included in the next batching process. And oftentimes that will kind of up your ranking if you've applied before. But I just want to say I launched a poll. Just curious how likely folks are to consider NRCS cost share programs for their sugar bush. And I think, Alan, you did a great job of kind of listing off the main topics that I was thinking of in terms of thinning, forest regeneration, deer, invasive species, energy efficiency. The last aspect that might be relevant to sugar producers in particular is the trails piece of NRCS work. And can you just talk a little bit about some of the eligibility for trail work and how that might apply to sugar makers?
Sure. Yeah. So our forest trails practice, it's one I think that there's definitely confusion around it. So again, we're going to go back to that resource concern language and saying that yes, there's a conservation problem there. So something on a forest trail that you might be using to access your sugar bush, if you have erosion that's getting into a water body, that's a fairly clear resource concern and where we would get involved. But if it's a flat spot or not much slope to it, and that soil's really not moving or going anywhere, it might be muddy, but we're probably not going to consider it a resource concern at that point.
What do you
And
think
like Tony,
about plant productivity in terms of root compaction and thinking about the maple tree as your crop?
it's potentially. I mean, if you're seeing signs of decline related to that, then maybe that could rise to the level of a resource concern. And that's probably something where you're going to need to get a forester involved probably to help make that case to a district conservationist, because that's probably not something a lot of our folks are going to be able to pinpoint on their own. So yeah.
Yep, and I think that's another benefit of working with a private forester is you can have that person be your professional advocate in some of these situations as well, and use their expertise to bring it to the table and help write up these plans or practices. Okay, I think we got everything in the chat. So I just want to again thank you, Alan, for coming in and sharing all this information. I'm gonna send a follow-up. Oh, we do have another question. What part of the EQIP program does soil erosion fall under? I would say
Yeah,
that soil erosion is going to be the concern that could lead to a number of different practices. So if you have
yeah,
soil erosion, there could be a number of different ways that you would remedy that. Oftentimes in the agricultural fields, they're looking at erosion and then changing tillage practices or the planting practices. So EQIP basically can fund a number of different practices to meet that soil erosion resource concern. So depending on kind of what the fix looks like is what your practice would be, but soil erosion would be kind of the justification for funding the EQIP practice. That
yeah.
sound right, Alan?
Yep, yeah. It definitely it's going to depend on the existing situation. But if if the question kind of stems back to more of those the trails you're using out there, probably be looking at things like water bars or drivable drain dips, that type of stuff, things that are gonna divert that water off the road, in several places before it can get to a water body.
Okay. Cool. So if it's trails in the woods that are eroding, does that qualify? It's tough to say. So the question is, if there's trails in the woods that are eroding, does that qualify? And like Alan was mentioning, if it's leading to siltation in a surface water body, like it's eroding into water, that's going to be an obvious qualification. Otherwise, it's probably going to take some eyes on the ground and a little bit more thorough understanding of the situation to just see whether it qualifies. But I think getting in touch with the NRCS district conservationists and talking through is probably the fastest way to see whether that makes sense. I'm going to just enter in a couple of links in the chat again, and then I want to go ahead and share my screen really quickly to just plug a couple of events. So again, thanks to Alan for the presentation today. I am going to send out links to everything that we shared in the chat, and then I'll update the Maple Hour page with the recordings. So you guys should all be able to catch up on that. And then upcoming, we've got some great Maple Hours in the works in December, February, and March. You can register for all those right now on our Maple Hour homepage. And then I really encourage anybody who's interested in taking their maple knowledge to the next level, going to the Winter Institute. I think for folks of all levels, there's stuff to take away from that. So just wanted to plug those two trainings quick, and then the Maple Hours, and thank everybody for tuning in today. Feel free at any time to reach out to me with questions about the Maple Extension Program. And then again, I've got a background in NRCS programming. So if you want to just spitball some stuff with me, I'm happy to do that too. So thanks again, everybody. Take care, and we will see you at the next edition of the Wisconsin Maple Hour.